It's not going to be quit day just yet for our call and response. And you remember last week I introduced the idea of a call and response where the leader says something, the congregation says something back. How many of you have a history, you've grown up in a church where that was a thing you did, like you're used to that, like you know what that kind of liturgical process is like. Sometimes it feels weird when like you're used to just being a listener and not a responder, but as we are learning from what Shema means, listening responds. You have to respond in order to give validation to the fact that you were hearing what was said. Well, I want to continue it, but I decided I was going to get really ambitious and I was going to make a video version of it so that I could actually start the service where we play the video and then like you see the line at the top that's read to you, and then there will be text in red that the congregation responds, and it's going to give me a chance to put my cough drop in so that I can speak while we're listening. But for this will be our first try with this call and response in video form.
Shema, O people of God. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, and strength.
Not too difficult, right? We can do that. We can handle that. And it gets you focused. It gets you to where you're thinking together as a group. You're speaking together as one body in unison. And the words that we're speaking, just like any vows you would take, they should have meaning. Otherwise, there's no sense in repeating them. So we're going to be continuing Shema for this entire year. This is our second week in the first series of this year. It's a series called Noticed, which is an exploration into being seen by God, how we can be seen. And it comes from the Hebrew name Reuben, and the meaning of that, which that word means see a son. Reuben was the first son born of Jacob. There are 12 sons of Jacob, and there are 12 months in the year. Reuben is the first month and the first son. So this first entire month, as we embark down this road of 2026 and our Shema theme of responding in obedience, we will have a whole month of talking about seeing in response to hearing. I'm not going to be talking about Reuben every week of this month of January, just like I won't be talking about Simeon every week in the month of February or on from there for each of the 12 sons. Rather, it's going to be just that idea of Reuben meaning seen. The word means seen. So all the weeks of January will be about some sort of fashion of being seen by God. If it were just Reuben all the way through the month, although it would be possible, if I wanted to drag it out, I could kind of make that work, it would be too much. It would be too hyper-focused. I even think it's too over-hyper-focused to consider doing all Old Testament stories every single week. So just think of it like every month is that category, that concept, and that meaning that comes from the name. And we'll draw examples from wherever they happen to come from. Sometimes it'll be New Testament, sometimes Old Testament. For this particular week, however, it ties in very, very closely with what we did last week. So we are going to be studying again from the Old Testament this week. Last week's story was a little bit about Rachel and Leah, if you recall the stories of Rachel and Leah, and how Jacob was very, very into one of those two sisters. He really, really had a desire for Rachel, and he had done whatever he could to earn favor with Laban, the father, so that he could marry Rachel. That was the one he desired. But Leah, in fact, becomes the first one that is shown favor by God, as she is given the first blessing of producing a son for Jacob. And that son, as we studied last week, is Reuben. You got this. Leah had never really found happiness. She had never seen joy in her life. She always felt overlooked and rejected. But God specializes in using the rejected. He specializes in finding the underdogs. In all the ways that Jacob mapped it out and orchestrated how his physical labor and the works that he did could help to be exchanged for the marriage of his dream girl, God was crafting an entirely different story. God had his own narrative to map it all out in ways that Jacob never thought would happen. He had no idea that he was going to end up with Leah as well. He had no thought for any of that, but God had different narratives and different lessons for Jacob, Leah, Rachel, Laban, all of them. So we learn from the story that God sees the rejected when others don't. God uses them for glorious and majestic purposes. And over again, he reveals his nature and his love through forgotten underdog stories, through people that he puts right at center stage. And when God is using the unnoticed, that unnoticed person gets to play a really big role in his narrative, but not typically in like a quick, transformative way. Like you don't get to experience in these stories that we see from what God has done in people's lives. Those underdogs don't immediately become center stage like they would like in a Disney movie where, like the magical animals overnight make a dress for Cinderella and she's ready to go right away. Or like, all the magical swirly dust things that go around, like whatever princess, somebody becoming from a peasant to a princess, and it just transforms right away. Boom, there it is. Typically, we don't have that when we're seeing God's big reveal. It can take the transformation for an unnoticed person that God is using months, even years, before you see that transformation and how it happens. Like the story of Joseph, for example, one of the other sons of Jacob. Joseph was abused by his brothers. He was sold into slavery, and his brothers assumed that as he was sold into slavery, that's just where his life's going to end. Like everything that he had built up and he had found favor in his father would be gone as soon as he was sold into slavery. He was sold into slavery, and then 13 years later, noticed by officials, earning a place in Egypt where he could be an authority. He could be a prominent figure. And then 9 years after that, allowed for his brothers to see redemption and survival as they come back to Egypt looking during a time of famine for food. 22 years after he was sold into slavery was his transformation process revealed, where his brothers could realize this brother that we despised, that we sold into slavery, has become the one who redeemed us and forgave us. God's long stories of transformation and utilization take place over extended periods of calculated time. It's evident that his hand is in a bigger picture. We can't always see the picture and understand the picture. Sometimes it pops up on a screen and we don't know what it means, and we hope that later we'll know what it means. Much of what you think is happening in the world can go unaware, and you only get to see later how amazing that transformation is. It means nothing to the people in Egypt that weren't his brothers that Joseph began as a Hebrew slave. No one else in Egypt had any idea or cared where he came from. They just knew his importance in their lives. But his brothers knew his roots, they knew his story, and they understood what that transformation was. They saw that bigger picture, and it made sense to them in the big realization. Like if you're drinking spring water, anybody ever really do you like a certain bottle of spring waters, or like a brand that you just feel is just the freshest of all spring waters? Like it just feels so just nourishing and rewarding. When a new spring is found, when people are looking for new drinking water, rarely does anyone really stop and think where that water came from, right? You don't question it. It's just, here's spring water for you, and it's clean, it's fresh, and it's from the ground, and it's great. But it comes from somewhere. Typically without thought, we consume it, especially if you're really thirsty. But it has an interesting process to get to where it is. That picture that you saw a minute ago, this shows what that process is like. Millions and billions of seemingly insignificant drops of water, rain that comes from the ground, things that wash in and soak in from wherever, they all work their way into the soil. And the top layers of the soil is just very loose and sporadic, and the water sits at the surface, and a lot of it will evaporate, go back into the sky, and fall again as rain. But eventually those drops will make it farther into the soil, and they'll work their way down into the rocks. And those rocks get closer and closer together to where they become impermeable. You have a spot where the water can't drop below that table. It's just done. It's solid rock. And as they settle through that, you get natural filtration. And that natural filtration can take years, centuries even, where the water continues to trickle through and seep through, and then it works its way down through gravity into an area where it can come back up in a spring form. So that water that came from the sky and fell and trickled through and filtered eventually becomes the fresh natural spring water. That water could have been, in the 1700s, rain that fell, that the colonists came through with their horses and trampled over and walked across and let all the mud and nastiness fill up into it, and then it trickled down, and then it filtered, and then it got better. That water could have been from even centuries before that. Maybe there was a rainstorm with a massive flood of geese flying through in the 1400s. They stopped for some sort of drink of refreshment as they're on their way migrating south. They stop for their rainwater, and in the process they leave their obvious goose mess. All those droppings, that's very unmistakable goose droppings, all across the ground. Water soaked through all the way with goose nastiness. You picturing it while you drink your water? But centuries go by, and all those minerals and all that goose stuff gets filtered through and fertilizes the soil, and the purities shine through, and the impurities are filtered out as it works its way through that rock, making its way all the way down to where it is pure and clean natural spring water. Things can stay unnoticed for a very long time. I am really thirsty for spring water now too, by the way. Water takes a long time to reach that bottle. And God's plan can take just as long sometimes. Sometimes an entire life can go by and not see the entire picture of his plan played out. Let's talk about Abram and Sarai for a little bit. You know them usually as Abraham and Sarah, but before that they started as Abram and Sarai. Genesis 16 is going to bring us into this story, where they came from. They're older in age. They're really, really hoping to have a family. They have no children of their own yet. Abram really needs to have a son. Genesis 16, we have Sarai devising a plan because they are not having children yet. Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. God had promised Abraham would have a son, even though he was really old. And Abram had faith in that promise, and we have record that credited to him as righteousness. But after 10 years of nothing happening, Sarai had not conceived, and that original promise is still holding in there. They want to remain faithful, but Sarai is starting to wonder what's going to have to happen here. We have to remember, though, at this point, the promise that was given was just that Abram would have a son, not specifically that he would have a son with Sarai. So she creates this plan. Let me give you the quote first so you see. This is Genesis 15. Then the word of the Lord came to him. "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your flesh and blood will be your heir." That's all it says in chapter 4. It doesn't say a son with Sarai will become your heir. It just says a son. So Sarai's not feeling as though she's doing anything rebellious here by offering the slave girl. She decides to help in the process by bringing another woman in the scenario. So this is something that's understandable from this time in history. It was a very big deal to produce an heir. You needed to produce a son to continue the bloodline. And if it wasn't possible through the standard monogamous relationship of one man and one woman, oftentimes you bring another wife into the scenario, or a concubine, or another relative can be adopted in as a family member, or just someone as an outsider can also be adopted in as well. They all become part of the family so that the bloodline and the history and the heritage can continue on. Sarah is seeing these alternative options to serve her husband by allowing this possibility. And she didn't see it happening through her, so she offers up Hagar instead. Genesis 16:30. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. We have a tension building up here. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Hagar's entire existence was to serve. She's an outsider, though. She's not part of this family. She's come in as an outside slave. But she was in many ways viewed as disposable in this scenario. She had no inheritance. She had no family, no claim, nothing to Abram. Whereas Leah, in the story that we had last week, Leah was introduced into Jacob's household. She was at least part of the family to begin with. Hagar was not. Different roles, same pattern. The story Leah shows us is that God sees the unloved. The story Hagar can show us is that God can see the cast out. Both women produced children. Both women also saw rejection. Both women are called out by God when the rest of the world has rejected them. Let's keep on going here. 16:7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that is beside the road to Shur, like where water's coming out. You see, like water that's been sitting for a long time. You see how that connects to what I did before? You get the connection as the gears turning? Yeah, okay. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai. I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. She only answers the first question. She doesn't answer the second one. I don't think she even knows where she's going at this point, so all she can do is answer the first one. I want to take a second here and point out this angel, the way it refers to an angel. If you look at the original text, it isn't just saying an angel like the way we've had, like, the New Testament with messenger angels and stuff. This actually is really, it's a little deeper than that you have sort of a physical representation of God that is speaking on behalf of God, and it is still God in the presence, as in another form that Hagar is able to see. So she is seeing it as God, and the best way that could be described through words, we translate as angel, but it's sort of like a physical representation of God. So the angel of the Lord said to her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. So here we have Ishmael's name, which just happens to have the word Shema right there in the middle of it. See the Shema part? There are no vowels in Hebrew, so it would all just be the consonants. So you'd have the that's Shema. We know what that means. That means hears. And El means God. So, henceforth, we have Ishmael means God hears. They're going to continue on, verse 12. More describing about who Ishmael's going to be. He will be a wild donkey of a man. That's a fun phrase. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. So conflict both ways. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. That verse doesn't really paint an awesome picture for Ishmael, since the angel is basically forecasting his entire life. He's going to live in hostility, but even so, he will be the beginning of an expansive nation. And we know this from history, what we have of recorded genealogies in the history of man, that the descendants of Ishmael will go on to be much of what we know today to be Arab nations, whose conflicts with Israel have been ongoing since the beginning of time. But the point here is that Hagar was noticed. She had been rejected by the household that she was serving, and she had done everything that was asked of her to help that household. But in her rejection, she was seen by God. Even in the wilderness, outside of the family, outside of any promise, outside of protection, near some little stream of flowing water coming out of the ground, she was seen and then heard. God heard her cry. And for her, it was a magical Cinderella twirly kind of a moment where she feels instant transformation. Her entire existence felt transformed by this encounter with this angel. She felt value, she felt purpose, and she was given her own promise. So in response to her encounter, Hagar does something that no other person in all of the Bible does. Do you know what it is? Hagar gives God a name. She puts a name for God. Genesis 16:13. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well, which is that little spring of water that's there, was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar gives God the name El Roi, which means the God who sees me. And that leads to the name of the location, which is the well where the living one sees me, or the well of the living one who sees me. And it's still possible to locate wells in this region because these locations still exist and you can track them to know where they are map-wise. Maybe not specifically which one was this exact one, but there is proof that there are wells in this area. Even if they're all dried up, they still are reminders, even to this day, that the most remote, outcast places can still have sources of life and renewal. Even when we feel outcast in the desert, God sees us. So Hagar will give birth to her son, Ishmael. And God defines the promise more specifically in chapter 17 to go on and clarify to Sarai, she will have her own flesh and blood. 17:19. Then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. Both Ishmael and Isaac are given large families. They're given numerous descendants, too many to count. And while two families may go through centuries of angst and turmoil and conflict with each other, they have roots in the same family from two different promises. Paul points this out in Galatians chapter 4, verse 29. At that time, the son born according to the flesh persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit, referring to Ishmael and Isaac. It is the same now. The conflict continues to exist. It has been ongoing for centuries. But sometimes God's story pans out over centuries. Sometimes, like that cycle of water that goes through the ground and is filtered through the layers of rock, sometimes God is like that, where we need the years of filtration. We need years of it working so that that bigger story can be told. The God who sees us can provide living water to everyone, even those who feel like they're outcast, separated from a family. I want to leave you with a poem. I don't read a lot of poems in sermons, but we started the call and response thing. Let's do a poem too. Why not? It's not a Christian poem. This is, in fact, probably more likely to be cited by people that want to praise just nature itself and celebrate just nature. But it still is, if you hear it from the terms of Hagar and Ishmael, it can resonate as a poem for an outsider who feels like a failure, who can still give praise for that bigger story, and knowing that they have a place in God's greater plan for all of humanity. This is a poem called Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. Anybody know it? Not a lot of poetry fans in this place. Wild geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, those geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to you, to your imagination. calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. The world is a big place. Is it not? It's a big place. But even in the outskirts of that big place, we are seen. At our lowest, we are seen. At our weakest, we're seen. So let us recognize the El Roy, the God who sees us, and listen for his voice in our lives as we continue to pursue and please him. Amen.